Hey, good morning, Money Warriors. It's Tanya here. I wanted to take some time to actually just walk you through understanding the week ahead of you next week. Next week, we're exploring the realm of money mindset, which is really about understanding your mind with money and understanding where some of your programming came from so that we can better lock in a plan going forward. So last week under money management, what you were able to uncover was the reality or the truth of your financial situation. And what I want you to know about that reality is that that reality was simply a reflection of your limiting patterns, beliefs, opinions, and attitudes. It was the decisions that you made, consciously or subconsciously, that got you into that position. It's really that simple. So I don't want you to have all the judgment and angst and shame around those numbers, because we're going to reframe that. The other thing that we ended up doing last week is that we came up with a new number, a new reality for you that is going to put you in a place of financial safety and security and joy and abundance, whatever it is for you. Our objective this week together is twofold. We want to uncover the limiting patterns and beliefs that got you into the first situation to start off with. And then we actually want to reframe them so that you can actually achieve your new goal. So it's really that simple. That's what our week together is going to look like. And Buddha here actually starts us off quite nicely with his quote, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought." And I'm going to walk you through that so you can better understand it and believe it. All right, so this is oversimplifying, obviously, our neurosystem here, but our brain, in essence, has three core components. We have the thinking brain, also known as the neocortex, and it is responsible for a lot of our motivation, our drive, our ambition. It's where we get extremely logical and rational with respect to our thought process. We have our second piece of the brain, brain 2.0, which is the emotional brain, also known as the midbrain. Now, it's this emotional brain that really kind of governs our feelings, our memories, our experiences. And then our third part of our brain is called the instinctual brain, also known as the primitive brain. And it makes up, there's a couple of components that make up this instinctual brain, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the instinctual brain is hardwired, and it's specifically hardwired for survival. It is extremely reactive, and it is that piece of the brain that's going to keep you alive. You really don't need to think much when actually you're not thinking at all when it comes to the instinctual part of the brain. It is the part of the brain that's governing your heartbeat, your breath. We're not thinking about doing those things. It's just automatically happening to keep our system going. So these three brains, it's interesting. I'm going to give you a little example here how these play out. Maybe some of you have heard this example before, but I use my Kicking Horse Coffee example. So I'm going through Safeway. I'm a big fan of Kicking Horse Coffee. I'm going through one of the aisles. I see Kicking Horse Coffee is on sale for $9.99 a bag. I decide, absolutely, I'm grabbing it. It's normally $16.99. My neocortex is firing up. My thinking part of the brain is doing the math. I'm realizing that I'm going to save, excuse me, close to $7 on that bag of coffee. So I load her up. I put it in the cart. I check out. And on my way out of Safeway, I hear an espresso machine starting to fire up, and they're shh. And I look over and I see a Starbucks double frappuccino, caramel frappuccino, mochaccino being prepared for a customer. It's on the bar. They're loading it with whipped cream, caramel sprinkles, the drizzle. It looks so good. And here I've just spent $9 on a bag of coffee. That's probably going to get me about 30 to 50 cups of coffee. But there's Starbucks on that caramel frappuccino, and my emotional brain kicks in. And I go, oh, that would feel so good to drink, that warm fluid dripping down my throat with the whipped cream. And I buy the $8 Frappuccino. The next piece of the brain is the primitive brain. So let me go back to that Safeway example, or that aisle, where I'm back in aisle 5 and I see the Kicking Horse coffee and it's $9.99. And I think, oh my gosh, it's such a great deal. I need to get as many as I can. So I call up the family, I get everyone over, I ask them to load up their bins. Everyone's got their maximum 5 per customer. We've got 5 people, they go to separate aisles, and we end up with 25 bags of Kicking Horse coffee. Don't know where that's coming from. It's not emotional, it's not thinking, it's actually part of my hard wiring that feels this need to load up on 25 bags of Kicking Horse coffee. And I'm going to explain that to you a little bit going forward. So those are your 3 brains, and kind of how all of these decisions are made. Now, when we speak about decisions, decisions actually come from a cellular level. So we are made up of billions of cells in our body, 60 billion to be, well, no, I shouldn't say to be exact, anywhere from 50 to 60, 65 billion. Now, the cells in our brain are called neurons, and each little cell actually comes with its own specific programming. And so we need to understand where this programming is coming from. So what is happening right now, and you can almost imagine yourself this morning waking up, 95% of the decisions that we make on a regular basis are coming from our subconscious mind. We're not actually thinking about them, right? When you think about waking up, did you think about what side of the bed you were going to wake up on? Maybe you went to the washroom in the dark. You did not need to turn on the light. You did not need a map. Maybe you walked downstairs in the morning to make your coffee, but did you count the stairs? I suspect not. Did you even hang on to the railing? I suspect not, right? When we brush our teeth, when we wash our hair, when we get in the car, when we drive from A to B, the majority of our decisions, the majority of our actions are coming from our subconscious. They estimate 95% of our actions are coming from our subconscious part of the brain, and 5% are coming from our conscious part of the brain. So when it comes to developmental programming, there's going to be 2 types of programming I'm going to talk about here today. One is developmental and the other is inherited. When it comes to developmental programming, we too followed this model of consciously programming our brain and then subconsciously programming our brain. So the conscious programming typically happens from the time that we're 6 to 12. 6 to 12, this is where we are rationalizing what we are hearing, we're applying logic to it, but it is also about, and I want you to be very aware of this, it was your interpretations of what you had witnessed or observed, and your interpretations is key to this, especially as we go throughout the week. So I want you to think about different scenarios that may have played out in your early environment. So within your family, within your structure, within your context, what were you seeing? What were you hearing? What were you feeling, right? So different things like, you know, who took care of the money? Did someone have to ask for money? Was there constantly this dialogue of, we don't have enough? Were you being told that you weren't deserving of? Did one sibling make more money than you? Did you have siblings that were actually trying to influence you or control the situation or your environment? All of those things and your interpretation to them is what formed your conscious, not your conscious programming. It's what formed a big piece of your program. So this is why we're going to do the money memoir, because it was those early memories of, what did you get for Christmas? What didn't you get for Christmas? Did you get an allowance? Did you not get an allowance? And I'm going to give you some examples here for you to think about. But I want you to know 6 to 12, big piece of your developmental programming. And it was your interpretation of what you witnessed, which also includes what your environment felt like, right? Because you might have been hearing one thing where, oh, we have lots of money. Our family's okay. We're taken care of. We'll never find ourselves in debt or in trouble. But what you were feeling was something very different to that. You felt lack, you felt scarcity, you felt fear, you felt anxious. So we need to be very conscious of what we might have been being told versus what we were actually feeling. So then there's the subconscious part of our brain. This is typically our programming 0 to 6, and you're going to understand here why I have less than 6 here in a minute. But 0 to 6, this is our subconscious mind, where we can't necessarily rationalize the information that we're interpreting. And instead of potentially interpreting that information, it's more an absorption piece. So the subconscious brain, I want you to think back to, sorry, you can't think back because it's subconscious, but it goes back to those early days of what were you feeling? Were you feeling loved? Were you being picked up? When you looked at facial cues and expressions from your mom primarily, also your father, were they loving? Were they kind? Were they supportive? If that was not happening, then, well, if that wasn't happening, we tend to feel like we're in an unsafe environment. If it was happening, then we tend to feel that those feelings of love and joy and happiness. So all of those absorption issues is what went into your programming from 0 to 6, right? So it was all of those cues that you took in, you internalized, and has really made for a very strong basis with respect to why you used to make the decisions that you made. So that's a little piece on developmental. Now, I want you to understand that the developmental programming can both be through traumatic incidences or chronic incidences. Both of them have the ability to impact our cellular structure and our cellular programming. So traumatic is obviously situations that are typically one-off. Hopefully, sometimes they do happen repeatedly, probably not every day, but obviously physical abuse, emotional abuse can happen with traumatic. I had a client that was once locked in a closet for a week because he challenged his father. After years of getting the wrong salary, he challenged his father on, you know what, we had negotiated this and you haven't been doing this, and I just wanted to ask, you know, at what point I might be able to get the salary that, or the allowance that we had negotiated on. And the father was irate and ended up locking him in the closet. That's an example of traumatic. Chronic, as an example, a client that I worked with, there was a financial consequence attached to every decision that she made as a child. And some of them, obviously 95% of her decisions were not conscious. So if she mistakenly ripped a page in a book, or if her shower was too long, or if she chose to have a more expensive dinner item, she would not get the dessert or beverage. Every single decision that she made had a financial consequence attached to it. So if she ripped the page out of the book, there was a tally sheet on the money owed that she owed back to the family for destroying that piece of property. Shower went too long, she owed the family X number for hot water because the shower went over. So that sort of chronic repetitive messaging obviously had a big part of what her pattern, her programming looked like. So believe it or not, all of us have programming. And this is why we have to do the money memoir, to actually understand the developmental piece of our programming. Where did we get our programming from? Because every single decision that you have made to get you into the financial situation you were last week came from that programming. So we have to uncover it so we can reframe it. Now, that's developmental. And I have something to add here because this is where it gets really interesting. So when we talk about cells, I talked about our neurons, which are the cells in our brain. It was understood that our cells are actually getting directed by our genes. So our cells turn to our genes to understand the programming. Now, genes are specific sequences of DNA, right? And these are inherited sequences of DNA. So, genes are inherited sequences of putting this information together. It's units of information that gets passed down. The DNA is formed up of different sequences of these genes and how they get put together. So epigenetics is the science of understanding how our cells are reading our genes or those sequences of DNA. So again, let me repeat that. Epigenetics is the science of understanding how our cells are interpreting the gene sequences. Very simple. So this is a relatively new area. It came out in early 2000s, specifically with the genome experiment and stem cell research, right? So what they have found now, which is really interesting, what they've proven is that, sorry, I'm trying to get this to you in a way that we can digest. What they've proven is that it is the environment of the cell that can actually turn on and off switches in DNA. So they didn't realize that DNA actually had switches before. So now they have established that the environment that the cell is in can turn off a gene expression, silence it, or turn it on, express it over time. So what this means to you is that we can turn on and off programming. It's that simple. So one of my favorite experts in this area is Dr. Bruce Lipton. Now, I don't want to confuse you here because I'm still wrapping my head around this, and he is cutting edge. What he is actually starting to prove now is that you can actually remove the entire DNA sequence from the cell and the cell still operates. And it actually just simply turns to its external environment and the receptors through the membrane, and it completely transforms the internal energy of the cell. So I'm going to leave that for now, but this is kind of the way this is going, which is fascinating. So back to why this matters to you. This matters to you because we can, A, change the environment that the cell is in, and we're going to talk about this next week under motive, right? So that we can find different ways to reprogram our cellular structure. But the other reason why this is so important is because if we now know that it's the environment that turns on or turns off the DNA sequence, we have to look at what environment actually started to contribute to a lot of our programming. So obviously, the very first environment that we experience as a fetus is in utero, right? So this is where you need to, and there's a bonus round for this. It depends on how entrenched you want to get into this. But I have to say, a lot of warriors that I know, there's a lot going on for them with respect to programming when it comes to in utero. So just very quickly, what happens in utero is that if our mother was experiencing any sort of trauma in her environment, that is getting embedded at a cellular level and it's getting passed down to us in utero. Crazy. So questions that you'll be asked this week: did something traumatic happen to your mother while she was pregnant with you? Was she highly anxious, depressed, or stressed? Did she experience postpartum depression? Obviously, that's when you're born. Were you separated from your mother shortly after birth? Did your mother give away a child, lose a child, or pregnancy before you were born? Because oftentimes that stress and worry of miscarriages gets fed down to you, right? Unsafe environment. Was your mother's attention pulled to a traumatic event involving, excuse me, one of your siblings, or her relationship with your father, right? All of those things are impacting the environment in which you are actually developing. So it is that environment that has started to form the programming of your cells. Now, what they have proven here again, which is so fascinating, is that what happens to this little fetus is that if the environment is unsafe, they have proven that the cellular development starts to move from developing the neurocortex, and it starts to overdevelop the primitive brain to keep you in survival mode, right? Because your environment isn't safe. So it's triggering that primitive brain, and you're getting a lot of cellular development there. They have also proven that there's cellular development that moves away from your core and into your extremities, your arms and your legs. Physically, what's happening to this little fetus is that this environment is creating a street fighter. It is creating a fetus, and maybe this was you, to turn you into a warrior that could survive. Isn't that amazing? It's amazing. Now, what's important here is, yes, we've got the benefit of you're a warrior. Unfortunately, what happens here, because your primitive brain now goes into survival mode, one of the things that we subconsciously do, and I'm saying we because this is certainly me, I don't know how many others out there, but what we have subconsciously done is that we have subconsciously chosen to keep ourselves in an environment that we're familiar with, which is typically unsafe. So for those of you that don't have investments, for those of you that don't have any emergency net, no emergency funds, this might be where it stems from. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. Okay, moving on to inherited. My goodness. So inherited, one of my favorite experts here is a gentleman by the name of Mark Wallin. He's an author of a book called It Didn't Start With You. You'll find all of these in our equipment room under resources. So inherited trauma, epigenetics, excuse me, I have to take a sip. I'm looking forward to this cold being gone. Epigenetics has now proven that we inherit the cellular programming from 3 generations past. So it's not just your parents, it's your grandparents and it's your great-grandparents. And because our brain is hardwired to keep us alive, it tends to remember the traumatic events, right? That's what's triggering on the switches, and that's typically what we inherit. So it's interesting, we will be going through an exercise called the money tree, and the money tree is going to get you to list out both sides of your family. And you're going to start to understand, oh, okay, you know, what were they experiencing back in those days? Wartime, famine, floods, poverty, depression, right? There was a lot of mental illness happening there, and nobody to really be able to deal with it effectively or properly, and a huge stigma around it. So it wasn't even being talked about, and the shame around it. A lot of immigrants, I work with a lot of clients who come from, you know, second, third generation that came over to Canada, and especially in the agriculture world, were given maybe some of land that maybe not have been the best land in Canada to be able to farm. So just the ebbs and flows of you know, the booms and busts of farming and agriculture in general. So this is going to be extremely fascinating for you, and everyone has their own journey here. But when you start to understand the generations that came before you, you are going to start to realize that you are just reliving their trauma over and over and over again. It's their patterns, their programming that you inherited that we need to stop. Now, what I will tell you is that when you heal it, you've actually healed it at a cellular level, and it's done. It's done. You've healed it for the generations going forward. Now, what you can do with that too is you can take that healing and you can pass that on to your kids, so that the cycle ends here. It's an incredible, incredible process, and I'm so excited for you to explore it. All right, so now that we understand where our programming came from, both developmental and inherited, I want you to understand how this starts to impact as a pattern. So we're born with inherited patterns, right? 0, we're born with it, and then 0 to 12, we start to develop those patterns, and they're then, sorry, we don't develop that. We're developing the patterns, but they start to get embedded at a cellular level, those developmental patterns. 12 plus, the patterns actually emerge, and we start making very specific decisions based on those patterns. Now, what happens is that when we start making those decisions, they're usually conscious, right? Because this is a new decision for us to make. And obviously, because it's conscious, it tends to be more painful. So if we know that we're putting money into, you know, a new pair of jeans or game, and we're not doing what we should be doing with it, there tends to be shame or guilt or some sort of pain attached to that. Of course, as we start to make these decisions more regularly, they become habits, right? So your patterns repeat in your 20s. Now you're just moving into, you know, into your semi or subconscious realm where you're not even thinking about what you're doing. And obviously, because you're not thinking about it, it doesn't carry a lot of pain for you. And then 30 plus, now it's definitely a habit. It's completely embedded. You have no recollection of what you're doing. Sorry, not recollection, but no awareness of what you're doing. And there is no pain attached to it. Now, these numbers, obviously, these age ranges are different for everybody. But in my experience, where I see people is 35 to 50, where it's the cumulative effect of the decisions that they've made. Now they're feeling pain, right? It's the carrying the debt. It's the losing loved ones because they thought if all they did was make money, that everyone would love them and everything would be okay. It's not having any safety or security and always feeling stressed and anxious and not knowing how to get out of a specific situation. All right, gang. So what our week is going to look like here, now that we understand the basis of where our programming comes from, right? We're going to have to do a deep dive in understanding exactly what our programming is. So to understand the developmental piece of our programming, we are going to do a money memoir, which is your first exercise tomorrow. Day 2 is actually where you're going to go through the money memoir and you're going to start to highlight the patterns, the feelings, the beliefs, the opinions, so that you can see them. So in the money memoir, I don't want you to use your prefrontal cortex. I want you to dig down into the emotions and into the memories that you have around what you were seeing, what you were hearing, what you were observing, what you were feeling in your early childhood. Then day 3, we get into the money tree. The money tree is the inherited programming, right? So we're going to do that money tree. We're going to chart out the your ancestry. And in there, we're actually going to do both emotional or psychological traumas that we feel that those generations were going through. We're also going to write down physical traumas because we've got a bonus round with Louise Hay with the mind-body connection. You will be amazed when you actually start to write out physical traumas like cancer, in where that cancer was experienced, lost limbs, depression, liver disease, MS, whatever it might be that was actually showing up physically for family members. Louise Hay, the pioneer in this space, believes that there's a mind-body connection, and when you attach the cause to the symptom, you're going to see that it's very reflective of the psychological traumas that they were going through. It's fascinating. Now, why that matters, again, is because you're going to see for yourself that you're repeating a lot of that trauma, which we have to put a stop to. Day 5 is a great exercise because we're actually just looking at all of the good stuff, right? Our first couple of days, there's a lot of really getting down into the trenches and looking at the trauma and, you know, getting it all out there because we've got to get those patterns gone. So day 5, we start to look at, well, what are all the great things that I have actually created? What are all of my assets? Because I'm going to start to focus on those. And those are very important, especially from an earning capacity. Because I know a lot of you are concerned about this new number now. So we're going to look at where your assets are, where your money makers are. And then day 6, as you know, is a day of reflection. So that's it. That's what our week ahead looks like. Rest up. It's going to be an emotional week for lots of you. I'm going to encourage you to carve out the time that you need to do this and carve out time afterwards. It's not a matter of writing the money memoir and then going out to dinner with the family. You're probably going to want hours of time afterwards just to sit in solitude and process it, especially after you've written that money memoir. That's where a lot of emotions are going to come up for you. Please sit in it. Sit in those emotions, write down, journal, all of that stuff. We need to get it out of your subconscious because that's where your patterns are coming from. So let's get it out. Don't sweep it under the carpet. Allow yourself to feel, write it down, highlight it, let's explore it, and then let's reframe it. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow, and I hope you're having a great weekend. No, not happy Remembrance Day, but looking forward to taking a moment of silence at 11 o'clock, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.